In this example, I want to go ahead and look at HTML tables and how you would structure an HTML table to render your table-based data. So tables in HTML kind of get a bad rap sometimes, and you'll hear people say, oh, you shouldn't use tables when working with HTML. Those people are misinformed, and what I'm suggesting by that is that people that say you shouldn't use tables are correct in one sense, in that you shouldn't use tables to style your data, and you shouldn't use tables to style your web pages. But if you have table-based data, so think of like a spreadsheet or a database table, if you have table-based data, then it really belongs in an HTML table if it's going to be on an HTML page. So if we're just rendering data and it's table-based data, then we should be using HTML tables, and that's what I want to cover today, is how you'd properly use an HTML table to render table-based data. Okay, so I have an existing project here, so I have this tables project and then the 3 subfolders that are underneath it, and I want to start off by creating an HTML page. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and save this file as index.html. So in web pages, I'm just saving this first file as index.html. And because it's an HTML page, my text editor knows that this is an HTML file, and I have those HTML templates. So I can just type in HTML and it brings in that HTML template. Our title for this is going to be HTML tables. And what I want to do is I want to list player information. So for instance, I might have a player name and a position, a height and a weight, something like that, or just player information, what team they're on or what city they're from. So just information that I want to render about the different players that might be on a team. Okay, so table-based data, so let's say we have 5 or 6 different players and we want to list them in a table so that it looks nice in a browser. So first thing I want to do is I want to have an HTML table, so beginning and ending table tags. And then at its most basic level, if I want to render an HTML table, and we'll kind of make this a little bit nicer and more granular, we'll add to this, but if at its most basic level, a table consists of rows and columns. So whenever I want a row, it's actually a table row, so that'll be a tr tag. Okay, so we have a table row. And then within our table row, we can either have table data, TD tags, or table headings, TH tags. Okay, so for our first row, we're going to make those headings. So we're going to have some THs within that row. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a couple of table headings. So maybe like first name, and then last name, maybe city. Okay, maybe that's enough. So we have one row, and each row contains 3 columns: first name, last name, and what city they're from. And we can take a look right now. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And the idea is that we have one row with 3 table headings or column headings in that row. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that Atom Live server. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. Brings up Chrome. I can go into my web pages. And you'll see that I have a table that has the first name, last name, and city. Okay, I want to style this a little bit just so you can get a better idea of what's going on with this table, because it's going to be important as we move forward with tables. So as you're first starting out with tables, one thing I'd suggest is putting a border around your table. Okay, so in order to do that, I'm going to link to an external style sheet. So here's my style sheet reference. And then I'm going to go ahead and move up a directory. I'm going to move into the style sheets folder. And then there's master.css. So I'm going to create that file, master.css, and I'm going to say that all tables should have a border that's solid. Okay, and then you'll see my table. And in fact, I might even be more specific and say all of my TD tags should have a border. And why am I not getting that? Sorry, I don't have any TD tags yet. I don't have any table data. I just have table headings. What I am going to do is I'm going to say that my TH tags have a border bottom that's solid. Okay, so this is the start of my table. Okay. So right now I have 3 column headings, and now I want to add some data to my table. So I want to add, 5 or 6 different players, and each player is going to belong to a row. And unlike the first row that we had, now we're no longer talking about table headings. We're talking about actual data. So that data is going to show up in a table data tag. So this first row really needs 3 columns. The first table data tag is for the first name, so it's going to match the first column. The second table data tag is for the second column, which is the last name, and then the third one is for the city. So if I go ahead and say, Aaron Rodgers and Green Bay, and then I want to do the same thing for another row. So I'm just going to copy and paste this row here. So we can go ahead and pick Christian Yelich, and we'll put him in Milwaukee. And then we can pick another, and let's go ahead and pick a football player, Patrick Mahomes, and he's in Kansas City. Okay, so those are our 3 rows of data. So we have columns, and then we have 3 rows of data within our table. And you'll notice that our table data then shows up. We have 3 rows of data, first name, last name, city, for all of them. We can now get into our style rules, and we can say that we want to make all of our TD tags have a border that's solid. Okay. And that's how we're going to have our tables. So we have our table tags are important. We have rows of data within our table. A lot of times that first row is going to be a table heading. So there are headings for your table. So if like the first row of your data set is your heading information, you use TH tags. And then secondarily, if we have our data, we put those in table data tags. Okay, so then what ends up happening is sometimes we have data that spans multiple columns or multiple rows. So for instance, if we're talking about Christian Yelich and we want to put them on Milwaukee, okay, so let's go ahead and just paste in another record here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Lorenzo Cain, and I want Lorenzo Cain in Milwaukee. And then we can skip over and look at that. So we have our 4 players here. I would argue that Lorenzo Cain and Christian Yelich, all of the Milwaukee players, could be bundled, and then I wouldn't have to duplicate the city. Okay, so I want to say that all of these folks, all the Milwaukee players, and I might create a list of Milwaukee players, I want to group them all together in the same city. So in our case, we just have Lorenzo Cain and Christian Yelich, and we want to put them both in Milwaukee. We might want to do the same thing for the Packers and same thing for the Chiefs in those various cities. But for now, let's just focus on Milwaukee. So instead of duplicating data across multiple rows, what I want to do is I want to have a single cell of data that's going to span multiple rows. Okay, so we know that this instance of Milwaukee and this instance of Milwaukee, there should only be one instance of Milwaukee. So I want to delete an instance of Milwaukee. So I'm deleting the instance where Lorenzo Kane should belong to Milwaukee. And I'll go ahead and put a comment here. And the way I'm going to get that, so the way I'm going to put Lorenzo Kane being in Milwaukee is I want to use this Milwaukee from Christian Yelich, and I just want to carry it down. The way I'm going to do that is that this cell of data is going to span multiple rows. So the idea is that we want Milwaukee carried down into the second row. So since they're side-by-side rows, I want to carry it down, and it's going to span 2 rows. And that I use the terminology span, and the reason why is there's a row span property, and I can say that it's spanning not 1 row but 2 rows. And now you'll notice how that table lays out. Both Christian Yelich and Lorenzo Kane belong to Milwaukee for their city, spanning multiple rows. Okay. Likewise, I could do something like, for instance, let's say I have another player. So let's say it was not a player, but I wanted to talk about Madonna. And Madonna, one name only. So she doesn't need a first and last name. And what I want to do is I want to have Madonna, and I'll put Madonna in Green Bay. And you'll notice how that things are shifted now. So since Madonna is not going to have a last name, now I have a problem where Madonna doesn't have a city, even though Green Bay is supposed to be the city for that person. Okay, so what I want Madonna to do is I want it to span both the first and last name. So I want it to span 2 columns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that that table data spans 2 columns, not 1 but 2. So we have these properties, row span and col span, that are going to allow you to have one piece of data span multiple columns. And I'm leaving one thing out, which is I could have a combination of those things. I could have Madonna being in Green Bay, but then I could also put Madonna next to Aaron Rodgers and have Green Bay span multiple rows, or I could have Madonna span multiple rows. So I can do row spans and col spans together is what I'm getting at here. I don't know that it makes sense for our example, but I can combine row spans and col spans as well if I need to. The only requirements to this are I need to match the number of columns that are defined in my table for each row. So if I go back over to my table, right at the very beginning, I said that my table row has 3 different columns, first name, last name, and city. And every table row that I have has to have 3 columns. And you'll notice that I break that for Lorenzo Kane. And the reason I'm able to break that for Lorenzo Kane is because of me using the row span of 2. So I carry down a column from the row above. So I carry down a column from the row above, and that's what fills in Milwaukee for Lorenzo Kane. Same thing with Madonna. I need 3 columns, but I start with 2 just based on the name. So the name Madonna is taking up both the first and last name. So it's 2 columns because the col span equal to 2, and then Green Bay is the third. So because I have 3 columns in my table, every row within my table really should have 3 columns. It's not a hard and fast rule, so sometimes I have 3 table data tags. Other times I'm not going to have 3 table data tags, and that's because I might be spanning rows or I might be spanning columns. Okay, and that's what ends up happening with my table. Okay, so I have my table. If I want to get more specific about my table, I can start to be a little bit clearer to someone looking at my site. So for instance, this is the heading of my table, and I have these table heading tags. What I can do is I can actually group my table using T-head tags. So in the T-head, I'm going to have this row. This is the head of the table. And then once I have the heading, I can have my T-body. And I'm going to go ahead and indent all the data that would be part of the body of my table. And IntelliSense isn't helpful there. And you'll notice the table doesn't look any different. So I still have my T-head section and T-body section, but I have all of the exact same data and it's rendering the exact same way. And then lastly, like I have a T-head section, a T-body section, and then I can have a T-footer section, T-foot. And again, same thing here. I'd have a row of information, and here you might put like summarized data. So for instance, maybe I have a list of expenses, and then I want to total up those expenses at the end. Or maybe I have a list of investments and I want to total up those investments or come up with an average or something like that. So my footer might isolate that aggregate data. So maybe mean, median, and mode data that might belong in my footer. I don't know that it makes sense for the example I'm showing you right here, but the idea is that I'm able to give more information to someone that's looking at my table. So my tables can get really complicated, but oh, here's the headings. Oh, here's all the data. And then here's kind of the summary data in the footer. With those groupings, so the T-head, T-body, T-foot, they're not required. So they're available to you. You saw that the table was rendering just fine without them. I'm able to add them. It doesn't change much other than it gives the reader of my HTML code a little bit more data about, hey, this is how I've sectioned things off. This is where the heading is. This is where my data is. This is where my footing is, or the table footer. Okay, not required, but sometimes allows you to organize your tables a little bit better. Okay, so HTML tables are super important. They allow you to render table-based data, whether it's a spreadsheet or a relational database table or any kind of table-based data. It allows you to render it really cleanly and nicely in a browser. What I would suggest is that tables are great for table-based data. They're not great for layout. If you look at old HTML sites and before CSS really became popular, what you'd see is that developers would use tables to lay out their pages. So for instance, if I wanted a 3-column layout on an HTML page, I'd create a table that had 3 columns and make it span 100% of the width of the page. And then I'd have that 3-column layout just based on the fact that I have a 3-column table. Okay, so that was done all the time before CSS became really popular. Now you're going to avoid styling your sites with tables. Okay, so it's kind of a fine line. I keep saying, you know, if your data is table-based data, you should be using tables. You shouldn't be using tables for layout, and you shouldn't be doing styling within your tables. And a lot of times when you're first getting started with HTML, it's hard to make that distinction. Am I actually doing layout or am I just rendering my data? What I would suggest, and my rule of thumb, and this is not a hard and fast rule, but what I like to look for is when I build an HTML table, do I use row spans and column spans? Because if I am, then I'm laying out the data. and I'm laying out the data using tables as opposed to styling that data using style sheets. I would suggest that Rowspan and Rowspan are fine in small doses, but if you're consistently using Rowspan and Rowspan, you're probably doing more layout in tables than you should be. Okay, and again, it's not a hard and fast rule to say, hey, if you're ever using Rowspan and Rowspan, you're doing it wrong. That's not accurate either, but I would suggest that if I'm consistently using Rowspans and Rowspans, and maybe every row I'm using a Rowspan across multiple rows, that maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I should be using some kind of layout tools. Maybe I should be using CSS to style these pieces of information. Okay, so that's really what I'm looking for with styling, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Okay, so this is kind of our discussion on tables, and I want to go ahead and stop here for our table discussion.